What if you inherited millions tomorrow? Would it change you? When Daniel Morgan suddenly becomes wealthy, a fierce German shepherd named Thor becomes his obsession and ticket to status, until a shocking revelation changes everything. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, nestled in the rolling Appalachian Mountains where morning mist clung to ancient oaks, Daniel Morgan's life changed forever with a single phone call. At 45, his entrepreneurial ventures had yielded modest success, enough for a comfortable life, but far from the wealth he'd always craved. The lawyer's voice on the other end sounded almost apologetic. "Mr. Morgan, your uncle Frederick has passed away. He's left you his entire estate, including the mountain property and, well, his dog." Daniel stood on his porch, phone pressed to his ear, watching as the sun broke through the clouds. His hands trembled slightly. "How much are we talking about here?" "Just north of $7 million, sir. Plus the 100-acre property." The following week, Daniel drove his dusty pickup truck up the winding mountain road to what was now his land. The property revealed itself like something from a dream. A sprawling craftsman home with stone pillars and wraparound porches, overlooking valleys that stretched to the horizon. As he stepped from his vehicle, a deep, guttural growl froze him in place. "Jesus Christ!" Daniel stumbled backward as a massive German shepherd lunged toward him, stopping short only because of a heavy chain anchored to a nearby oak. The dog's muscles rippled beneath its black and tan coat, teeth bared in a snarl that made Daniel's blood run cold. The caretaker, an old man named Harlan, emerged from the house with a knowing smile. "That there's Thor, your uncle's pride and joy, meanest guard dog in 3 counties. He always like this?" Daniel asked, maintaining his distance. "With strangers? Worse, usually. Frederick trained him special. Nobody gets near this property without Thor's say-so. And Thor don't say so to nobody he don't know." Harlan chuckled. "Once saw him chase off a bear. Damn near took down a timber rattler too." Something shifted in Daniel as he watched the powerful animal. In that moment, Thor wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of the power Daniel had suddenly inherited. Over dinner that night with his wife Elaine, Daniel couldn't stop talking about Thor. "You should have seen him, honey. 120 pounds of pure muscle and teeth. Nobody's getting past that dog." Elaine tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, concern evident in her hazel eyes. "Sounds dangerous. What about when the kids visit? Maybe we should find him a new home." "Are you kidding? That dog's staying right where he is." Daniel topped off his whiskey glass. "In fact, I was thinking of having some friends over this weekend. Show off the new place." "That's fast." Elaine chose her words carefully. "We haven't even decided if we're moving there yet." Daniel leaned forward. $7 million, Elaine. "We're moving. And I want people to see what we've got now." That Saturday, Daniel's friends from town gathered on the property. The autumn air carried the scent of barbecue and bourbon as Daniel led the group toward the area where Thor was chained. $20 says none of you can get within 10 feet of him, Daniel challenged, a new cockiness in his voice that made his oldest friend, Sheriff Mike Townsend, raise an eyebrow. "You sure about this, Danny? That's a working animal, not a party trick." $50 then, Daniel countered, ignoring the warning. "Any takers?" By sunset, Daniel had collected over $300 in failed bets. Each attempt ended with retreating men and Thor's threatening growls. With each victory, Daniel's chest puffed a little more, his voice grew a little louder. Watching from the porch, Daniel's father Robert, a weathered man of 80 with kind eyes that missed nothing, shook his head slowly. In his 50 years as the county's most respected veterinarian, he'd never seen his son like this. Wealth had changed Daniel overnight, bringing something ugly to the surface that had always lurked beneath his insecurities. "It's just excitement, Dad," Elaine said softly, joining the old man. "He'll settle down." Robert Morgan wasn't so sure. "Money doesn't change who you are," he replied, watching his son holding court by the fire pit. "It just makes you more of what you already were." The transformation in Daniel Morgan continued over the next few weeks, as subtle as the changing season, yet undeniable to those who knew him best. His clothing upgraded from worn flannels to tailored shirts, his reliable pickup now parked beside a gleaming black SUV. The small hardware store he'd owned in town, Morgan's Fix-It, suddenly had new signage and expanded hours, with Daniel rarely present. Morgan Estate. He'd taken to calling the property, despite the fact that the mailbox still read Frederick's Place in faded lettering. Each weekend brought new guests, no longer just old friends but business associates, local politicians, and anyone Daniel deemed worthy of witnessing his newfound status. And at the center of it all, Thor. $200 says you can't make it to that oak tree with him unleashed. Daniel challenged a burly contractor one crisp October afternoon, pointing to a spot 30 yards from where Thor paced. "You're gonna get someone hurt, Danny," cautioned Sheriff Townsend, who had taken to attending these gatherings out of growing concern rather than friendship. Daniel clapped the sheriff's shoulder with false camaraderie. "It's all in good fun, Mike. Besides, Thor knows what he's doing, don't you, boy?" He didn't approach the dog as he said this. Never did. The irony wasn't lost on the observers. Daniel feared the dog as much as anyone. From the wraparound porch, Elaine watched with increasing dismay. The woman who had once admired her husband's quiet determination now barely recognized the man entertaining the growing crowd. Their twin sons, 16-year-old boys with their father's strong jaw and their mother's thoughtful eyes, had taken to avoiding these weekend spectacles entirely. "He's not even the same person anymore," Elaine confided to Robert Morgan as they observed from a distance. The older man's presence had become her anchor in the swirling changes. "Pride's a peculiar thing," Robert responded, his voice carrying the soft drawl of Appalachian wisdom. "It fills up all the empty spaces a man's been carrying around." Daniel's always worried he wasn't enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't respected enough. Now he thinks money's fixed all that. Elaine clutched her sweater tighter against the autumn chill. "We had a fight last night. I found out he's put $40,000 into renovating the boathouse into some kind of entertainment space. Money we'd saved for the boys' college fund." Robert's weathered hand covered hers briefly. "He'll come around." "Will he?" "You didn't hear him, Robert. What's the point of being rich if nobody knows it?" Those were his exact words. Below them, cheers erupted as the contractor made a brave but foolish attempt to approach Thor. The German shepherd's bark echoed across the property, sending the man scrambling back to safety while onlookers laughed. Daniel collected his winnings with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. That night, after the guests had departed, Daniel found Elaine in their bedroom, methodically folding laundry with the precise movements that signaled her anger. "Another successful day," he announced, loosening his tie. "Made almost $2,000 in bets." "Congratulations," she replied flatly. "I'm sure that makes up for Jason and Mark skipping dinner again." Daniel's face hardened. "They're teenagers. They'll get over it." "Will they? Or will they just get used to their father valuing showing off more than family time?" She placed a stack of towels in the linen closet with unnecessary force. "This isn't you, Daniel. These people aren't your friends. They're here for the spectacle, for the free food and drinks, to see if the mighty Thor will finally maul someone. You don't get it, do you?" Daniel's voice rose. "My whole life I've been Danny from the hardware store. Now people respect me. They listen when I talk. They tolerate you because you're rich now," Elaine countered, her calm facade cracking. "That's not respect." Daniel's face flushed crimson. "What would you know about respect? You've been perfectly happy being nobody special for 20 years. The silence that followed hung heavy between them. Elaine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "Is that what you think? That I'm nobody special?" Daniel immediately regretted his words, but couldn't find the humility to admit it. Instead, he grabbed his jacket. "I'm going to check on Thor." Outside, the autumn night was cold and clear, stars sharp as pinpricks above the mountains. Daniel made his way to Thor's enclosure, a spacious fenced area with a custom-built shelter that cost more than some cars. The German shepherd watched his approach with alert amber eyes, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "At least you know who's boss," Daniel muttered, maintaining a safe distance. "Everyone else thinks they can tell me what to do with my money, my land." Thor continued to watch him, unblinking, unimpressed. "Next weekend," Daniel continued, talking more to himself than the dog, "I'm going to invite Congressman Hayes. His support could be worth millions for the development deals I'm looking at." He paused, a smile spreading across his face. "And we'll show him what happens when someone challenges the king of Maple Hollow, won't we, Thor?" The dog's only response was to turn away and retreat into his shelter, leaving Daniel alone with his delusions of grandeur in the growing mountain darkness. By November, Frost painted the Appalachian mornings with delicate white patterns that vanished beneath the midday sun. The mountains surrounding Maple Hollow blazed with the last vibrant colors of fall, deep crimson maples and golden oaks standing defiant against the approaching winter. But the beauty of the season was lost on Daniel Morgan, whose focus remained fixed on his increasingly elaborate weekend spectacles. Word had spread beyond the town limits. What had begun as casual gatherings of locals had evolved into events drawing visitors from neighboring counties. Daniel had installed stadium-style seating around Thor's enclosure, complete with a betting board where odds were calculated and wagers recorded. The quiet mountain property now regularly hosted 50 or more spectators each Saturday. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel announced through a wireless microphone, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly formal against the rural backdrop. "Today's challenger comes all the way from Charlotte. Mr. Devin Hargrove is a professional dog trainer with 20 years of experience and certifications in aggressive animal rehabilitation. He believes he can approach Thor without triggering an attack." The crowd murmured with interest as a lean man in his 50s stepped forward. Unlike previous challengers, Hargrove carried himself with quiet confidence, his movements deliberate and controlled. "The wager stands at $5,000, Daniel continued, unable to mask the slight nervousness in his voice. He'd never faced a professional before, and $5,000 was significantly more than previous bets. "Mr. Hargrove has 3 minutes to make physical contact with Thor without provoking aggression." Sheriff Townsend leaned against his patrol car at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed. "This has gone too far, Robert," he said to the elder Morgan, who stood watching with troubled eyes. "There's got to be animal welfare violations here somewhere." "Thor is well fed and housed," Robert replied softly. "The law won't find fault with his care. It's the people I'm worried about, my son most of all." Daniel released Thor from his chain but kept him within the fenced enclosure. The German shepherd paced the perimeter, his powerful muscles tense beneath his thick coat, amber eyes fixed on the stranger preparing to enter his territory. Hargrove entered the enclosure with slow, measured steps. Unlike previous challengers who had approached directly or attempted to run past the dog, the trainer turned his body sideways, avoiding eye contact. From his pocket, he removed something small that he kept concealed in his palm. Thor's posture changed immediately. The dog's ears, typically flattened in warning, perked forward with interest. His growl faded to a curious whine. "What the hell?" Daniel muttered, watching in disbelief as the German shepherd's aggressive stance softened. Hargrove continued his careful approach, speaking in a low, rhythmic voice that didn't carry to the spectators. Thor tilted his head, then, to the astonishment of everyone present, sat down, his tail sweeping the ground in a hesitant wag. "Time," Daniel shouted, too quickly. "That's time." "It's been 47 seconds, Morgan," called Sheriff Townsend, checking his watch pointedly. The crowd began to murmur, some checking their phones to verify the elapsed time. Daniel's face flushed red as Hargrove calmly extended his hand. Thor sniffed it cautiously, then allowed the trainer to touch the top of his head, briefly, but unmistakably without aggression. The spectators erupted in a mixture of cheers and complaints as betting outcomes were thrown into confusion. Daniel stormed into the enclosure, causing Thor to immediately revert to a defensive posture, hackles raised. "What did you do?" he demanded, keeping a wary distance from both the dog and the trainer. "What was that in your hand?" Hargrove opened his palm to reveal a small clicker device. "Standard training tool." "I didn't trick your dog, Mr. Morgan. I read him." "That's cheating," Daniel insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "Using tools wasn't part of the agreement." "Seems fair to me," called someone from the crowd, triggering a chorus of agreement. Daniel looked around wildly, sensing control of his audience slipping away. "The bet is void. Everyone knows Thor doesn't let anyone near him." Hargrove regarded Daniel with professional detachment. "Your dog isn't naturally aggressive, Mr. Morgan. He's responding to specific triggers, tension, direct approaches, loud voices. He's actually quite well trained, just not in the way you think." The trainer turned to leave the enclosure, pausing to address the crowd. "This animal shouldn't be used for entertainment. He's intelligent and responsive, but confused by inconsistent handling." Daniel watched in helpless rage as Hargrove departed and the spectators began to disperse, many demanding their money back. Thor retreated to the corner of his enclosure, watching his master with what almost seemed like disappointment. Later that evening, Elaine found Daniel in his study, surrounded by betting ledgers and empty whiskey glasses. "The boys and I heard what happened today," she said quietly. Daniel didn't look up. "It was a fluke. That trainer used some kind of trick." "Daniel." Elaine's voice hardened. "How much money did you lose?" "I didn't lose anything," he snapped. "The bet was invalid." "How much?" Daniel finally met her gaze, defiance crumbling under her steady stare. 5,000. "But it's nothing compared to what we have. It's not just money you're losing." Elaine placed a folded paper on his desk. "Jason was accepted to that engineering program he applied for. The one that starts next semester. The one we can't afford now because you've emptied the college fund." "We have millions," Daniel protested. "Do we?" "Because I checked our accounts today." Her voice trembled slightly. "There's less than half of the inheritance left, Daniel." "Where's it going?" "The renovations don't account for everything." Daniel's silence answered her question more eloquently than words could have. "You've been covering losses," she realized aloud. "Thor doesn't always perform the way you claim." "It's my money," Daniel said quietly, a dangerous edge to his voice. "And I'll decide how to spend it." Elaine straightened, wrapping dignity around herself like armor. "It was supposed to be our family's future, not your ego's playground." She turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "Your father called. He's worried about you." "We all are." Left alone, Daniel poured another drink and walked to the window overlooking Thor's enclosure. In the moonlight, he could see the German shepherd sitting alert, watching the house as if waiting for something or someone. "You made me look like a fool today," Daniel whispered to the silhouette of the dog. "It won't happen again." The Maple Hollow Apple Harvest Festival had been a community tradition for over 70 years, transforming the town square into a celebration of autumn bounty. Wooden booths lined the cobblestone streets, offering everything from fresh-pressed cider to hand-carved walking sticks. Children darted between hay bales and corn stalk decorations, while bluegrass music drifted from a small stage where local musicians took turns performing. In previous years, Daniel Morgan's contribution had been modest but appreciated, donating hardware supplies for the community projects, volunteering to judge the pie contest, always present with a friendly word and firm handshake. This year, however, Daniel arrived in spectacular fashion, driving his new black Cadillac Escalade directly onto the square, parking in a restricted area, and stepping out wearing an Italian wool coat that cost more than most festival-goers earned in a month. "Ladies and gentlemen of Maple Hollow," Daniel's voice boomed over the ambient festival noise as he climbed onto a picnic table. The music faltered as heads turned toward the disruption. "I have an announcement that I believe will make this year's festival truly memorable." Elaine, who had arrived separately with their sons, closed her eyes briefly in mortification. Beside her, Jason and Mark exchanged glances of teenage embarrassment. "My family has been blessed with good fortune," Daniel continued, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the discomfort rippling through the crowd. "And I believe in sharing that fortune in ways that bring excitement to our community." Sheriff Townsend moved through the gathering, positioning himself near Daniel with professional casualness. "Step down from there, Danny," he said quietly. "You're blocking the cider booth." Daniel acknowledged him with a tight smile before addressing the crowd again. "Tomorrow at noon, I'm hosting the biggest event Maple Hollow has ever seen. I'm offering half my inheritance. That's over $3 million to anyone who can get my German shepherd, Thor, to obey a simple command." The murmurs that followed were mixed with uncomfortable laughter. Most locals were familiar with Daniel's weekend spectacles by now, but the scale of this wager shocked even those who had attended previous events. "Have you lost your mind?" Elaine hissed as Daniel finally stepped down. "Half the inheritance." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's a sure bet, honey. Nobody can control Thor except me." "You can't even control him," she countered. "You stay 10 feet away at all times." "It's called strategy," Daniel replied dismissively, creating the mystique. Across the square, Robert Morgan watched the exchange from his seat at the veteran's booth. Though age had diminished his height, the former veterinarian's presence remained commanding, his snow-white hair and lined face reflecting decades of wisdom earned through service to the community. "Your boy's changed, Bob," remarked Henry Caldwell, a fellow Korean War veteran manning the booth. Used to be such a level-headed fella. Robert nodded slowly. Money has a way of revealing what's hidden in a man's heart. Sometimes what's revealed needs healing more than the poverty ever did. By mid-afternoon, Daniel's announcement had become the central topic of conversation throughout the festival. Some expressed interest in attending, others disapproval, but no one remained neutral. The Morgan family name, once associated with Robert's quiet service and Daniel's reliable business, was transforming before the community's eyes. Mark Morgan, the more outspoken of Daniel's twin sons, finally cornered his father behind the award platform. At 16, Mark had his father's build but his grandfather's thoughtful demeanor. "Dad, you need to call this off," he insisted. "It's embarrassing." Daniel's expression hardened. "You don't understand adult matters, son." "I understand enough to know Grandpa's right about what's happening to you," Mark shot back. "You think people respect you more now? They're laughing at you, Dad. Behind your back, they call you the dog man, like you're some sideshow attraction." The color drained from Daniel's face. "Who says that?" "Everyone." Mark's voice cracked with teenage emotion. "My friends, their parents. They ask if you're okay, if you've had some kind of breakdown. It's humiliating." For a moment, vulnerability flickered across Daniel's features, a glimpse of the man he had been before the inheritance. Then, like a shutter closing, his expression hardened. "When you're older, you'll understand. Respect comes from power, and power comes from money and what you do with it. These people," he gestured vaguely toward the festival goers, "they've been looking down on us for years." The hardware store owner who could barely afford new trucks for his business. Now they're paying attention. "Yeah, the wrong kind of attention," Mark muttered, turning away. "Mom's talking about moving back to our old house, you know. With us." Daniel grabbed his son's arm. "What did you say?" Mark pulled away. "Ask her yourself." That evening, as the festival wound down under strings of white lights that illuminated the falling leaves, Daniel found Elaine sitting alone on a bench near the old courthouse. The music had shifted to slower, melancholy tunes that matched the cooling night air. "The boys said you're thinking of moving out," Daniel said without preamble, standing stiffly before her. Elaine looked up, her face composed but weary. "I was going to tell you after the festival." "Tell me what exactly?" His voice was dangerously calm. "That this has to stop, Daniel. The gambling, the spectacles with Thor, the way you're spending money we need for our future." She met his gaze directly. "If you go through with tomorrow's stunt, the boys and I are going back to our house in town until you come to your senses." "You can't take my sons, our sons," she corrected firmly, "who barely recognize their father anymore, who are watching you throw away everything you spent decades building: respect, integrity, our financial security." Daniel paced in front of her, hands clenching and unclenching. "I've given you everything. A mansion, new cars, jewelry. I never asked for those things." Elaine's composure finally broke. "I married a man who cared more about being honest than being rich. A man who taught our boys that character matters more than possessions." "That man was a nobody," Daniel spat. Elaine stood slowly, gathering her dignity around her like a cloak. "That man was somebody I respected, somebody I loved." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Your father wants to talk to you. He's waiting by the cider booth. For your sake, for all our sakes, please listen to him this time." Daniel watched her disappear into the dispersing crowd, conflict evident in every line of his body. After several minutes of internal struggle, he made his way toward the cider booth where Robert Morgan waited patiently, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup. "Walk with me, son," the older man said simply. And despite everything, Daniel found himself following, like he had as a child when his father's quiet authority had been the center of his world. The mountain air grew sharper as father and son walked away from the festival lights, following a familiar path that wound behind the courthouse toward Maple Creek. Their footsteps crunched on fallen leaves, a sound that had marked autumns throughout Daniel's childhood. Neither spoke until they reached an old wooden bench overlooking the water, where generations of Morgan men had sat in contemplation. "Your grandfather built this bench," Robert said finally, easing his aged frame onto the weathered wood. "Right after he came back from the Pacific. Said he needed a quiet place to remember who he was." Daniel remained standing, hands thrust deep in the pockets of his expensive coat. "Dad, if this is going to be another lecture, no lectures." Robert patted the space beside him. "Just truths that need speaking." Reluctantly, Daniel sat, maintaining a physical distance that mirrored the emotional gulf between them. The creek gurgled softly below, water flowing over smooth stones polished by decades of current. "I've been watching Thor," Robert said, surprising his son with the direction of the conversation. From a distance, mind you, observing his behaviors, his reactions. Daniel stiffened. "He's my dog now. He's a complex animal with a history we don't fully understand," Robert corrected gently. "And he's trying to tell us something. If we'd only pay attention." "What's that supposed to mean?" Robert turned to face his son directly, moonlight silvering his white hair. "Have you noticed Thor never shows aggression toward children? Or how he responds differently to men versus women? Or how his behavior changes depending on the tone of voice used around him?" Daniel shrugged uncomfortably. "He's unpredictable. That's what makes the bets work." "No, son. He's entirely predictable, but the pattern isn't what you think." Robert's voice carried the weight of half a century working with animals. "Thor isn't naturally aggressive. He's responding to specific triggers, signs of threat or dominance. When people approach him with fear or challenging body language, he reacts defensively. When they approach with calm confidence, like that trainer did, he's receptive." "That's ridiculous," Daniel protested, though with less conviction than he might have managed a month ago. "He nearly took my arm off when I inherited the place." "And how did you approach him? Nervously? Directly? With the expectation of aggression?" Robert asked. "Animals reflect what we bring to them, Daniel. Same as people, in many ways." They sat in silence for several moments, the festival music now just a distant echo. When Robert spoke again, his voice was softer, laden with memory. "You know, your mother used to worry about you even when you were small. He cares too much what others think," she'd say. "He measures himself against everyone else." Robert cleared his throat. "After she passed, I noticed it too. How hard you worked to prove yourself, always needing to be seen as successful, competent." Daniel swallowed hard, fighting unexpected emotion. "What's wrong with wanting respect?" "Nothing, if it's respect you're truly seeking." Robert placed a gnarled hand on his son's shoulder. "But what you're chasing now isn't respect, Daniel. It's fear, envy, attention. Those things look like respect from a distance, but they're counterfeits." "You don't understand what it's like," Daniel said, a trace of the old bitterness creeping into his voice. "Working your whole life, struggling to build something, and still being treated like you're nobody special. Then suddenly having the means to make people notice you. I understand more than you think." Robert's eyes reflected ancient pain. "Your grandfather left me nothing but debts when he died. I built my practice from nothing, earned every client's trust during times when folks around here could barely afford to feed their families, let alone their animals. I know what it means to work for recognition. Then you should understand why I'm doing this." "What I understand," Robert said carefully, "is that you're risking everything that truly matters. Your marriage, your son's respect, your place in this community, for the hollow admiration of strangers who care more about spectacle than substance." Daniel stood abruptly. "I've built a legacy now, something people will remember." "Is that what you want to be remembered for? Betting on a dog?" Robert's voice sharpened. "The Morgan name used to stand for service, integrity. Your great-grandfather was the first doctor in this county. I cared for these people's animals for 50 years. You've built a business they depend on. That's a legacy, son." "Times change," Daniel said stiffly. "People don't." Robert rose slowly, his joints protesting the cold night air. "They still know the difference between a man who serves his community and one who uses it for his own glory." They began walking back toward the festival grounds, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. As they approached the lights, Robert stopped, turning to his son one last time. "Tomorrow, before your event, I'd like to spend some time with Thor," he said. "Just observing. Professional curiosity." Daniel's brow furrowed with suspicion. "Why?" "Because I think there's more to that dog's story than we know," Robert answered simply. "And because I believe in giving a man, or an animal, the chance to be understood before being judged." The gleam in his father's eyes made Daniel uneasy, but he nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but don't get too close. I don't want you hurt." Robert's smile held a sadness that Daniel couldn't quite interpret. "I've spent my life reading animals, son. Trust me to know when it's safe to approach and when to keep my distance." He patted Daniel's arm. "It's people I sometimes misread." They parted at the edge of the square, Robert heading toward his modest truck, Daniel searching the dispersing crowd for Elaine and the boys. Finding them already gone, he felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of money in his bank account seemed able to fill. Back at the Morgan estate, Daniel sat alone on the grand porch, watching Thor's silhouette pace in his enclosure under the cold November stars. For the first time since inheriting the property, he found himself wondering what his uncle had known about the dog that he didn't, and what secrets those watchful amber eyes might be keeping. The morning of the grand wager dawned with unusual clarity for late November, the sky a deep cerulean blue that contrasted sharply with the remaining autumn foliage. Daniel rose before sunrise, sleep having evaded him for most of the night. The master bedroom felt cavernous and cold without Elaine, who had followed through on her ultimatum and taken the boys to their old house in town. Daniel showered and dressed with mechanical precision, selecting an outfit he thought projected success and authority: a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and a tie the color of blood. The mirror reflected a man he barely recognized, thinner, with new lines etched around his mouth and dark circles beneath his eyes. By 9 o'clock, vehicles began arriving, workers setting up additional seating, a sound system, refreshment tables. Daniel had spared no expense, even hiring security personnel to manage what he anticipated would be record attendance. Local media had picked up the story, and a reporter from the Asheville Gazette was already setting up camera equipment near Thor's enclosure. "Mr. Morgan?" A young man in a company polo approached hesitantly. "Where would you like the betting station set up?" Daniel gestured vaguely toward the west side of the property. "Over there. And make sure there are enough clerks to handle the volume." "Yes, sir. And the notary is here to witness the contract signing for any successful challengers." Daniel nodded dismissively, his attention drawn to a familiar truck coming up the long driveway, his father's ancient Ford, moving at its usual unhurried pace. As arranged the night before, Robert had come to observe Thor before the crowds arrived. Daniel met him at the vehicle, noting how much older his father looked in the harsh morning light. Robert moved with the careful deliberation of a man conserving energy, each motion purposeful. "Morning, son," he said simply, retrieving a battered leather bag from the passenger seat, the same veterinary kit he'd carried on house calls for decades. "What's that for?" Daniel asked sharply. "You're just observing, remember?" Robert's eyes crinkled slightly. "Old habits. I've never approached an animal without my kit." He gestured toward Thor's enclosure. "Shall we?" They walked in silence across the frost-covered lawn. Thor noticed their approach immediately, rising from his shelter with ears alert, amber eyes tracking their movement. Unlike his usual aggressive display, the German shepherd remained watchful but calm. "He's different this morning," Daniel observed, puzzled. "He's reading us," Robert replied. "Animals sense tension, anticipation. Right now, we're just walking, conversing normally. No threat posture." They stopped at the edge of the enclosure. Thor stood his ground, neither approaching nor retreating, his gaze fixed primarily on Robert. "Beautiful animal," the old veterinarian murmured. "Belgian lines, I'd guess. See the depth of chest, the angle of the hindquarters? Classic working shepherd." Daniel watched uneasily as his father studied the dog with professional assessment. Uncle Frederick said he was specially trained for protection. "Cost a fortune. Did your uncle leave any paperwork? Training certificates, health records?" "There's a file in the house. I never bothered with it." "What?" Robert continued observing Thor, who had begun pacing along the fence line, occasionally glancing back at the elder Morgan with what almost seemed like expectation. "Because training leaves patterns," Robert explained. "And this dog has patterns that don't align with standard protection training." For nearly an hour, Robert observed Thor from different distances and angles, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound journal. Daniel grew increasingly impatient as more vehicles arrived, and the property transformed into the arena he had envisioned. "Dad, we need to wrap this up," he finally said. "People are arriving." Robert nodded slowly, closing his journal. "I'd like to see that file before your event begins." In Frederick's study, a room Daniel had barely altered since inheriting the property, they located a worn manila folder labeled simply Thor. Inside were veterinary records, registration papers, and several documents on letterhead Daniel didn't recognize. "Mountain Pines Therapeutic Services," Robert read aloud, his weathered finger tracing the embossed logo. Canine Rehabilitation Program. What's that supposed to mean? Daniel leaned over his father's shoulder. It means, Robert said quietly, that Thor wasn't trained as an attack dog. According to this, he was part of a therapy program for seniors with dementia and veterans with PTSD. Daniel snatched the paper, reading it with increasing disbelief. That's impossible. You've seen how he acts. I've seen how he responds to perceived threats, Robert corrected. Which is exactly what he was trained to do. Identify emotional distress and respond accordingly. He shuffled through more papers. Look here. Specialized training in reading body language, vocal cues, stress indicators. Thor was designed to be acutely sensitive to human emotional states. But he's aggressive. He's attacked dozens of people. Has he? Robert fixed his son with a penetrating gaze. Or has he warned them off when they displayed signs of aggression or fear? There's a world of difference, Daniel. Before Daniel could respond, a knock at the study door interrupted them. The event coordinator stood there, clipboard in hand, looking anxious. Sir, we have over 200 people here already, and more arriving. The local news crew is asking for a statement about the prize money. Daniel straightened his tie, trying to process this new information about Thor while maintaining his public persona. Tell them I'll be right out. After the coordinator left, Robert placed a hand on his son's arm. Cancel this, Daniel. Before someone gets hurt, and I don't mean by the dog. I can't. Daniel's voice was hollow. I've put everything into this. My reputation, my standing in the community. Your true standing in this community has nothing to do with spectacles or wagers, Robert said firmly. It's built on who you are, not what you have. It's too late. Daniel moved toward the door, shoulders squared with determination. The event starts in 20 minutes. Robert watched him go, sadness etched in the lines of his face. When Daniel was gone, the old veterinarian returned to the file, reading it more carefully. His eyes widened as he discovered a photograph paperclipped to the back page. A much younger Robert Morgan standing beside a group of therapy dogs in training. In the foreground, a German Shepherd puppy with distinctive amber eyes. So that's why, he murmured, memory stirring. The Mountain Pines program. I'd almost forgotten. Outside, the property had transformed into something resembling a county fair. Vehicles lined the long driveway and spilled onto adjacent fields. People clustered in groups around Thor's enclosure, which had been modified to include a clear entry point and a marked pathway. The German Shepherd paced nervously, clearly disturbed by the noise and crowd. Daniel stood on a raised platform, microphone in hand, the consummate showman despite the turmoil in his mind. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ultimate challenge. Today, one lucky person might walk away with $3 million, half my inheritance, if they can get Thor to obey a simple command. The crowd cheered, the excitement palpable. From the back, Robert Morgan watched with growing concern as his son outlined the rules. Contestants would enter one at a time, attempt to get Thor to sit on command, and have 30 seconds to succeed. The notary would witness any successful attempt, and payment would be arranged immediately. What no one noticed, amid the spectacle and noise, was Thor's increasingly agitated state, or the subtle signals that the dog was reaching his tolerance threshold for stress. No one, that is, except Robert Morgan, who recognized the warning signs from 50 years of animal behavioral observation. And no one, least of all Daniel, was prepared for what the old veterinarian would do next. The first challenger, a stocky man who claimed experience with military working dogs, entered Thor's enclosure with confident strides. The crowd fell silent, phones raised to capture the moment. Daniel stood at the judge's table, feigning calm while his stomach twisted with anxiety. The new information about Thor's background had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Thor's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. The German Shepherd's hackles rose, his lips curled back to reveal gleaming teeth, and a deep growl emanated from his chest. The challenger faltered, then pressed forward with false bravado. Thor responded by lunging forward, not attacking, but performing a textbook intimidation display that sent the man scrambling backward toward the gate. 30 seconds are up, Daniel announced, relief evident in his voice despite his attempt at showmanship. Better luck to our next contestant. 3 more challengers attempted similar approaches with identical results. Thor's responses appeared to validate Daniel's claims about the dog's aggressive nature, and the crowd's excitement grew with each failure. Few noticed the pattern emerging. that Thor's reactions intensified in direct proportion to the aggression or fear displayed by each challenger. Between attempts, Robert Morgan moved through the crowd, speaking quietly to Sheriff Townsend and several other community elders. Their concerned glances toward Daniel did not go unnoticed by Elaine, who had arrived with the twins shortly after the event began. She stood apart from the spectacle, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. "Mom, this is so embarrassing," Jason muttered, watching his father play to the crowd. "Everyone from school is here." "I know, honey." Elaine squeezed his shoulder. "But I think this needs to play out. Your grandfather has a plan." After the sixth failed attempt, this one by a woman who claimed to be an animal psychic, Daniel was riding high on apparent vindication. The betting tables were overflowing with wagers, all favoring the seemingly unbeatable Thor. The dog, however, showed increasing signs of stress, panting, pacing, excessive alertness. "Our next challenger," Daniel announced with theatrical flair, "comes all the way from Knoxville, a professional trainer with supposed expertise in aggressive breeds." The crowd parted for a young woman with close-cropped hair and a utility vest laden with training tools. She approached the enclosure methodically, studying Thor's body language with professional detachment. "Sir," she called to Daniel after a moment of observation, "this dog is in distress. He needs a break from stimulation." Daniel frowned. "The rules state 30 seconds per attempt. If you're not ready, I'm declining my attempt," she interrupted firmly. "This animal is showing clear signs of anxiety that could lead to defensive aggression. It would be unethical to proceed." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as the trainer walked away, some spectators exchanging uncomfortable glances. Daniel quickly moved to regain control of the narrative. "Folks, don't let one quitter discourage you. The prize money is still up for grabs. Who's next?" A tense silence followed, broken only when Robert Morgan stepped forward from the edge of the gathering. Despite his 80 years, he moved with the quiet dignity that had earned him respect throughout the county. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path toward the enclosure. "I'll try," he said simply, his voice carrying despite its softness. Daniel froze, microphone halfway to his lips. "Dad, no. You're not part of this." "I believe I am." Robert continued his steady approach. "As a citizen of Maple Hollow, I'm eligible under your stated rules." "You're too old," Daniel protested, desperation edging into his voice. "Thor could knock you down, hurt you. Then I accept that risk." Robert turned to address the notary directly. "I'm of sound mind and body, making this decision freely. Will you witness my attempt?" The notary, a serious woman from the county seat, nodded reluctantly. "The terms apply equally to all participants, Mr. Morgan." Daniel stepped down from the platform, intercepting his father before he could reach the enclosure gate. "Dad, please," he said quietly, his public persona cracking. "I don't want you hurt." Robert's eyes held a depth of understanding that made Daniel look away. "Some wounds can't be seen, son. The ones you're inflicting on yourself, your family, this community, those concern me more than any dog bite." Before Daniel could respond, Sheriff Townsend appeared at his elbow. "Let him try, Danny. He knows what he's doing." Trapped between his public commitment and private fear, Daniel stepped aside. The crowd fell silent as Robert Morgan, moving with deliberate calm, unlatched the gate and entered Thor's domain. The German Shepherd's reaction was instantaneous and shocking. The aggressive posture that had greeted all previous challengers vanished. Thor's ears perked forward with interest, his tail lowering from its alert position. He tilted his head, studying the elderly man with what could only be described as recognition. Robert stopped several yards into the enclosure, neither advancing nor retreating. He stood straight despite his years, hands relaxed at his sides. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority that had soothed countless animals throughout his career. "Hello, old friend," he said softly. "It's been a long time." Thor whined, a high, questioning sound that cut through the tense silence. The dog took a hesitant step forward, then another, nose working to capture the old man's scent. Daniel watched in disbelief as his father slowly, carefully, extended one hand, palm down in the universal signal of non-threatening approach. Thor continued forward until his nose touched Robert's fingers, inhaling deeply. What happened next stunned everyone present. The German Shepherd, the supposedly vicious, uncontrollable animal that had been the centerpiece of Daniel's betting empire, dropped to a sitting position directly in front of Robert Morgan. Then, with a soft whine, he leaned forward until his head rested against the old veterinarian's leg in a gesture of absolute trust. The crowd's collective gasp was followed by scattered applause that quickly grew into a sustained ovation. The notary stood, clipboard in hand, her expression a mixture of amazement and professional obligation. The command was obeyed, she announced formally. Verified and witnessed. Daniel stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Elaine appeared beside him, her hand finding his in a gesture of support despite everything that had transpired between them. "Did you know?" Daniel asked hoarsely, watching as his father knelt slowly to stroke Thor's head. "Did you know he could do that?" "No," she answered honestly. "But I know your father. He sees things in animals and people that others miss." Inside the enclosure, Robert continued speaking softly to Thor, who remained pressed against him, all signs of stress vanishing from the dog's posture. The transformation was so complete, so undeniable, that murmurs of disbelief spread through the gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert finally said, raising his voice to address the crowd, "I believe some explanation is in order." He gestured for Daniel to join him in the enclosure. Hesitantly, Daniel unlatched the gate and stepped inside, half expecting Thor to revert to aggression. Instead, the German shepherd remained seated, watching him with alert but calm attention. 15 years ago, Robert began, his voice carrying across the now silent property. "I volunteered with a program called Mountain Pines Therapeutic Services. We trained service dogs for various specialized roles, particularly for veterans and seniors suffering from PTSD and dementia." He rested his hand on Thor's head, the gesture natural and familiar. "This dog, or rather, his mother, was part of that program. I helped deliver her litter and assisted with the initial imprinting and training of the puppies." Thor was the most promising of the group, showing exceptional sensitivity to human emotional states. Daniel stared at his father, pieces falling into place. "You knew Thor all along? Why didn't you say something when I inherited him?" "Because I didn't make the connection immediately," Robert admitted. "It's been many years, and I worked with dozens of dogs through that program. But when I observed him yesterday, something seemed familiar. The records confirmed it this morning." He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice strengthening. Thor was never trained to be aggressive. He was trained to recognize emotional distress and respond appropriately. What appeared to be aggression was actually a defensive response to perceived threats, people approaching with fear or dominance, creating exactly the tension he was trained to identify. The revelation rippled through the audience. Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath him, not just figuratively, but in the realignment of everything he had built his new identity upon. The command he obeyed wasn't just sit, Robert continued. It was the context, approaching with calm, positive energy, using the hand signals he was trained with. Thor remembered, even after all these years. As if to confirm this explanation, Thor stood and moved to Robert's side, pressing against his leg in the classic service dog position. The transformation from feared beast to loyal companion was so complete that several people in the front row gasped audibly. Sheriff Townsend stepped forward. "I think we've all seen something remarkable today, and according to the terms set forth, Robert Morgan has won the challenge fair and square." All eyes turned to Daniel, waiting for his response. In that moment, facing his father, his community, and the truth about Thor, Daniel Morgan stood at a crossroads that would define not just his wealth, but his character. A profound silence settled over the gathering as Daniel stood motionless, the weight of hundreds of expectant gazes pressing upon him. The carefully constructed facade he had maintained for months was crumbling, exposing the insecurities and fears that had driven him since inheriting his fortune. For the first time since that transformative phone call, Daniel felt truly seen, not as the wealthy showman he had pretended to be, but as a man adrift, desperately seeking validation through all the wrong channels. Thor remained at Robert's side, calm and attentive, occasionally glancing toward Daniel with what seemed almost like concern. The dog that had been the centerpiece of Daniel's bid for status now stood as living testament to his misguided priorities. Daniel's voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again. "The terms of the wager were clear. My father has met them." He turned to the notary. Draw up the necessary paperwork. $3 million, as promised. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Surprise, respect, disappointment from those who had bet against a successful outcome. The notary nodded and began making notes, her expression professionally neutral. Robert took a step toward his son, Thor moving in perfect synchronization beside him. Daniel, that's not why I did this. It doesn't matter why, Daniel replied, a brittleness in his voice that belied his composed exterior. A bet is a bet. You won. Fair and square. Robert shook his head slowly. I don't want your money, son. Then what do you want? The question burst from Daniel with unexpected rawness, catching him off guard with its vulnerability. I want my son back, Robert answered simply. The man who built his business through honest work and genuine service. The father who taught his boys to value character over possessions. The husband who partnered with his wife instead of dismissing her concerns. Daniel's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. His shoulders sagged as the tension he'd been carrying for months released in a visible wave. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible, yet somehow carried to those nearest. I don't know if I remember how to be that man anymore. Elaine stepped forward then, crossing into the enclosure to stand beside her husband. I do, she said quietly. He's still there, Daniel. Underneath all of this. She gestured vaguely toward the elaborate setting they had created. Thor, responding to the emotional currents flowing between the humans, moved cautiously toward Daniel. The German shepherd stopped a few feet away, ears forward, head slightly lowered, a posture of non-threatening assessment. Daniel stared at the dog that had been both the symbol and instrument of his transformation. What's he doing? He asked his father. Reading you, Robert explained. Thor was trained to approach people in emotional distress, but carefully, giving them space to accept or decline comfort. He nodded encouragingly. Hold out your hand, palm down, if you're willing to accept his approach. With hesitation born of months of maintaining distance, Daniel slowly extended his hand. Thor moved forward with deliberate care, sniffing Daniel's fingers before pressing his head gently against the offered hand. The simple contact, the first direct interaction between man and dog since Daniel had inherited the property, caused something to break open within him. I've been such a fool, Daniel whispered, kneeling to meet Thor at eye level. The German shepherd maintained the contact, his warm presence offering unconditional acceptance that Daniel had been seeking in all the wrong places. Robert placed a hand on his son's shoulder. We all lose our way sometimes. The measure of a man isn't whether he falls, but how he rises afterward. Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse, sensing that the spectacle had transformed into something private and significant. Sheriff Townsend quietly directed people toward their vehicles, assisted by deputies who had anticipated the need for traffic management. The betting tables were dismantled, wagers returned with subdued efficiency. What happens now? Daniel asked, looking up at his father and wife. Thor still pressed against him. Now, Robert said, we begin the work of rebuilding. The following days unfolded with painful but necessary conversations. Daniel, Elaine, and the twins gathered around the kitchen table of their old house in town, the modest home that had sheltered their family for years before the inheritance. Thor lay nearby, his presence a calm counterpoint to the emotional intensity of their discussions. I want to come home, Daniel said simply. If you'll have me. Elaine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. It was never about the money or the house, Daniel. It was about losing you to something I couldn't fight. This person you were becoming. Mark, the more outspoken twin, leaned forward. Dad, you know what bothered me most? It wasn't the betting or even the way you were acting. It was that you seemed unhappy. Like, the more stuff you got, the less satisfied you were. Jason nodded in agreement. You used to laugh all the time, even when we were just grilling burgers in the backyard or watching old movies. Then suddenly, it was all about impressing people who didn't even care about you. Daniel listened, really listened, to his family for the first time in months. The truth in their words stung, but beneath the pain lay the foundation for healing. Their willingness to speak honestly, their desire to reconnect despite everything that had transpired. I don't know what happened to me, he admitted. It was like suddenly having all that money made me feel like I needed to be someone different, someone important, but I just ended up losing myself instead. Money changes the world around you, Robert observed from his place at the end of the table. It's up to you whether it changes who you are. The conversation turned to practical matters. What to do with the mountain property, how to handle the remainder of the inheritance, how to make amends to the community that had watched Daniel's public unraveling. I want to honor the wager, Daniel insisted. Dad won fair and square. Robert shook his head. I told you, I don't want your money. But I do have a suggestion for how you might use it. The elder Morgan outlined a proposal that had been forming in his mind since discovering Thor's history, reviving the Mountain Pines Therapeutic Services Program, which had closed due to lack of funding years ago. The mountain property could serve as the perfect training facility, providing service dogs for veterans and seniors throughout the region. Thor could even help train the new dogs, Robert explained, enthusiasm bringing color to his weathered cheeks. He remembers his training, even after all these years, and it would give purpose to that land beyond being a showpiece. As Daniel listened to his father describe the potential impact of such a program, something stirred within him, a sense of purpose more meaningful than anything he'd felt since receiving the inheritance. This wasn't about gaining approval or status. It was about creating genuine value, about service rather than self-promotion. I'd need help, Daniel said cautiously. I don't know the first thing about training service dogs. That's where community comes in, Robert replied. You'd be surprised how many people would step up to help with something worthwhile, including your old father, who still remembers a thing or two about animal behavior. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a lightness in his chest, a clarity of purpose that had been missing throughout his descent into prideful showmanship. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, requires patient rebuilding, but at least now he could see beyond the fog of his own insecurities. That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, Daniel sat alone on the porch of the family's townhouse. Thor lay at his feet, a steadfast presence that somehow bridged his past and future. From inside came the sounds of normalcy he had nearly forgotten. Elaine preparing dinner, the twins arguing good-naturedly over a video game, his father's quiet laughter at some shared joke. Daniel reached down to stroke Thor's head, marveling at how the dog had transformed from a symbol of power to an instrument of healing. We both got a second chance, didn't we? He murmured. Thor looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, then settled his head on Daniel's foot with a contented sigh. In that simple gesture of trust, Daniel found more validation than all the attention and envy his wealth had briefly purchased. The mountain property awaited transformation. The community waited to see if Daniel's change was genuine. The path of redemption stretched before him, challenging but clear. For the first time since inheriting his fortune, Daniel Morgan felt truly rich, not in possessions or status, but in purpose and possibility. The transformation of the Morgan estate began on a crisp December morning, with frost silvering the meadow grasses and thin ice rimming the property's small pond. Daniel arrived early, parking his old pickup truck, retrieved from storage after months of neglect, beside the imposing mansion that no longer felt like a reflection of who he wanted to be. Thor bounded from the passenger seat, exploring the familiar territory with renewed enthusiasm. The dog's integration into the Morgan family had been surprisingly seamless. He now slept at the foot of Daniel and Elaine's bed in their townhouse, accompanied the twins on hikes, and had developed a particular fondness for riding shotgun in Daniel's truck. "What do you think, boy?" Daniel asked, surveying the property with fresh eyes. "Ready to help make this place matter again?" As if in answer, Thor gave a short bark and trotted toward the enclosure that had once showcased his supposed aggression. Daniel followed, noticing how the once pristine grounds had begun to show signs of neglect. Fallen branches from autumn storms, garden beds overtaken by weeds, the ostentatious seating area now looking tawdry in the winter light. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Robert Morgan's truck, followed by a caravan of vehicles Daniel recognized as belonging to neighbors and longtime customers of his hardware store. Sheriff Townsend's patrol car brought up the rear, lights briefly flashing in greeting. "Right on time," Daniel murmured, nervousness tightening his stomach. This gathering represented his first public step toward redemption, a community meeting to discuss the transformation of the property into the Mountain Pines Service Dog Center. Robert was the first to approach, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing an expression of measured optimism. "Ready for this, son?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Daniel replied, unconsciously straightening his posture. "Thanks for helping arrange it. These folks want to see you succeed," Robert said quietly. "Remember that. They've known you your whole life, watched you grow up, supported your business. The man they saw these past few months wasn't the real Daniel Morgan." The gathering moved inside to the great room, where Daniel had removed the ostentatious furniture and replaced it with simple chairs arranged in a circle. The space felt cavernous, but somehow more welcoming without the expensive trappings he had accumulated during his spiral into excess. "Thank you all for coming," Daniel began, standing before the assembled group of 20 community members. His voice wavered slightly before finding its strength. "I owe everyone in this room, and many who aren't here, an apology. My behavior these past months hasn't reflected the values I was raised with or the person I want to be." Sheriff Townsend nodded encouragingly, while others maintained cautious but receptive expressions. Thor sat attentively at Daniel's side, a living symbol of the change being discussed. "Rather than continue trying to impress people with what I have, I'd like to use this property and the remaining inheritance to create something worthwhile for our community." Daniel gestured to his father, who distributed the documents he had brought, preliminary plans for converting the estate into a service dog training center. As the group reviewed the materials, Daniel outlined the vision that had been taking shape over the past 2 weeks. Using the main house as administrative offices and housing for trainers, converting outbuildings into training facilities, and developing the grounds for various training scenarios. The program would provide service dogs at minimal or no cost to veterans and seniors throughout the region. The initial funding, approximately $2 million, would establish the center and support operations for the first 5 years, Daniel explained. After that, the goal would be self-sustainability through grants, donations, and partnerships with veterans organizations. Martha Whitaker, who had taught Daniel in 5th grade and now headed the county's senior services, spoke up first. "This addresses a real need in our community. The waiting list for service dogs is years long, and most of our veterans and seniors can't afford the tens of thousands of dollars they cost." Others began contributing ideas and offering assistance. A retired Army colonel volunteered to connect the center with veterans groups. The agricultural extension agent suggested crops that could be grown on the property to reduce feed costs. The community college representative proposed student internships in animal care and training. As the discussion flowed, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since inheriting the fortune: the genuine satisfaction of creating value rather than simply displaying wealth. These people weren't impressed by his money. They were engaged by the purpose it could serve. "There's one more thing," Daniel said when the initial planning had concluded. "I'd like to rename the property. Morgan Estate never felt right, and my Uncle Frederick wouldn't recognize what I turned it into." "What did you have in mind?" Sheriff Townsend asked. "Frederick's Place," Daniel replied simply, honoring the man whose generosity made this possible, while reminding me of the responsibility that comes with inheriting not just wealth, but a legacy. The suggestion was met with approving nods. As the meeting wound down and people began to depart, many approached Daniel individually, not with the false deference he had once craved, but with handshakes, specific offers of help, and cautious but genuine expressions of support for his new direction. Martha Whitaker was the last to leave, pausing at the door to fix Daniel with the penetrating gaze that had kept generations of 5th graders in line. "You know, Danny, I always told your father you had a good heart under all that striving. Glad to see it's still there." Left alone with his father, Daniel exhaled heavily, the tension of the morning finally releasing. "That went better than I expected. People are more forgiving than you might think," Robert replied, "especially when they see sincere effort to make amends." He gestured toward the expansive windows overlooking the property. "This place has potential for real good now, not just show." The physical transformation of Frederick's Place began the following week. Daniel closed his hardware store for 2 days, the first voluntary closure in 15 years, to lead the initial work himself. Employees and regular customers volunteered their time, turning the project into something resembling an old-fashioned barn raising. The garish stadium seating around Thor's former enclosure was dismantled, the materials repurposed for training platforms and obstacle courses. The betting tables became workbenches in the new training barn. The elaborate entertainment systems were donated to the community center and veterans' home in town. As December deepened toward Christmas, the property began to reflect its new purpose. Training areas took shape across the grounds. The boathouse was converted into a rehabilitation space for dogs and humans alike, and the main house slowly transformed from a showpiece into a functional headquarters for the emerging program. Throughout the process, Daniel worked alongside everyone else, hauling lumber, digging post holes, painting walls. The physical labor grounded him in ways the accumulation of possessions never had, connecting him to the property through the sweat and effort he invested in its renewal. Elaine visited regularly, bringing lunches for the volunteers and offering design input for the living spaces. The twins helped after school and on weekends, Mark displaying unexpected talent for construction, while Jason meticulously documented the transformation with photography and video. "Have you thought about where we'll live once this is up and running?" Elaine asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and gold. "The house in town is home, but you'll need to be on-site often." Daniel considered the question, realizing he hadn't thought beyond the initial conversion. "What do you think? The main house is too big for just us, and it makes more sense as the center's headquarters." "The caretaker's cottage," she suggested, pointing toward a small structure near the orchard that they had barely noticed before. "It's the right size, and it would let us be here without being in the middle of everything." The cottage, a stone and timber building with a deep porch and simple, functional layout, represented everything the mansion was not: modest, authentic, connected to the purpose of the land rather than designed to impress. Daniel felt an immediate rightness to the suggestion. It would need work, he noted, already mentally cataloging the renovations required. Elaine smiled, squeezing his hand. "Good thing I know a hardware store owner who's handy with renovations." That night, driving back to town with Thor dozing in the truck bed, Daniel felt a contentment that had eluded him throughout the months of wealth-fueled excess. The path ahead was clear now, not easy, but purposeful. The remaining inheritance would seed something of genuine value, and his own skills and labor would help nurture it into sustainability. The following Sunday, the Morgan family attended the Maple Hollow Community Church's holiday service together for the first time in months. Daniel felt the curious glances as they entered, the quiet assessment of his changed demeanor. Where he once might have strutted in with new clothes and an air of superiority, he now walked beside Elaine in his regular Sunday attire, nodding greetings to neighbors with genuine humility. After the service, longtime residents approached not with the fawning attention he had once craved, but with authentic interest in the service dog center and offers of specific assistance. Daniel found himself discussing irrigation systems with a retired engineer, veterinary supplies with a former nurse, grant writing with a teacher. "They're responding to you differently," Elaine observed as they drove home. "Not because you have money, but because you're using it for something that matters." Daniel watched the familiar streets of Maple Hollow pass by, the hardware store with its simple sign promising fair prices, honest service, the diner where he'd eaten breakfast every Saturday for 20 years, the high school where the twins would graduate in 18 months. This community had shaped him, supported his business, known him at his best and worst. "I think I finally understand what real respect looks like," he said quietly. "And it has nothing to do with betting on a dog." Thor, riding between them on the truck's bench seat, rested his head briefly on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge how far both man and animal had come from their first wary encounter. Spring came to the mountains with a gentle persistence, transforming Frederick's Place with splashes of dogwood white and redbud purple. The harsh lines of winter softened as new growth emerged, mirroring the renewal taking place across the property. For months had passed since the community meeting that had set everything in motion, and the transformation was both physical and spiritual. The caretaker's cottage had become home to the Morgan family, its stone walls and timber beams offering a warmth that the mansion never had. Daniel and Elaine had renovated it themselves on weekends, stripping away years of neglect to reveal the simple beauty of its craftsmanship. The twins shared the loft space when they stayed over, though they maintained their rooms in the townhouse for school nights. In the early morning light, Daniel stood on the cottage porch, coffee mug warming his hands against the lingering chill. Thor sat beside him, alert to the stirrings of wildlife in the nearby woods. From this vantage point, Daniel could see the full scope of what Frederick's Place had become. The main house now served as the administrative center for Mountain Pine service dog training, its formerly ostentatious rooms repurposed as offices, meeting spaces, and dormitory-style accommodations for the training staff. The grounds had been thoughtfully developed with various training scenarios: urban street simulations, medical facility mock-ups, household settings with specialized equipment for those with physical limitations. Most significant was the presence of dogs: 12 German Shepherds, Labradors, and Golden Retrievers in various stages of training, selected from shelters and rescue organizations for their temperament and aptitude. Thor had proven invaluable in their selection and initial socialization, his calm presence setting the standard for the program's canine recruits. "Beautiful morning," Robert said, joining his son on the porch. At 80, the elder Morgan had found renewed purpose as the program's behavioral consultant, his decades of veterinary experience informing every aspect of the dog's training. "Gets more beautiful every day," Daniel agreed, passing his father a mug of coffee. The dogwoods really popped overnight. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the property came to life. The first trainers arrived, young people with backgrounds in animal behavior and veterans affairs. Soon the morning routine began, dogs being led to different training areas, maintenance staff tending to the grounds, the distant sound of the main house's screen door slapping closed as administrative work commenced. "We have visitors coming at 10, Robert reminded him. "The VA coordinator and 2 veterans interested in the program." Daniel nodded, mentally reviewing the preparation needed for their first potential placements. The program had been developing its protocols for months, and these would be the first real applicants to move beyond theoretical planning to practical application. "I'll meet you at the main house after I check in with Elaine at the training barn," he replied. She wanted to run through the demonstration sequence one more time. As Daniel walked the property, he exchanged greetings with each staff member by name, most of them locals who had known him his entire life. There was an ease to these interactions that had been missing during his months of wealth-driven arrogance, a mutual respect based on shared purpose rather than financial disparity. The training barn, once his uncle's workshop, then briefly Daniel's entertainment space, had been converted into the heart of the program's daily operations. Inside, Elaine worked with 2 young trainers and a black Labrador named Scout, guiding the dog through a sequence of tasks designed to assist someone with mobility limitations. "Perfect timing," she called as Daniel entered. "We could use a stand-in for the wheelchair demonstration." Daniel took his place in a training wheelchair, allowing Scout to practice opening doors, retrieving dropped items, and providing stability for transfers. The dog performed each task with focused attention, exemplifying the program's rigorous standards. "He's ready," Elaine confirmed, rewarding Scout with brief play and affection. "If the VA sends someone with mobility needs, he'll be a good match." "You've done amazing work with him," Daniel said, genuine admiration in his voice. Elaine had discovered an unexpected talent for training, her patience and intuitive understanding of both dogs and people making her invaluable to the program. They walked together toward the main house, discussing the day ahead. The easy partnership that had characterized their early years of marriage had returned, strengthened by the challenges they had weathered together. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is the same place," Elaine remarked, gesturing toward what had once been Thor's betting arena, now a peaceful training yard where a young woman worked with a golden retriever on alert responses for a diabetic handler. "It's not the same place," Daniel replied thoughtfully. "Frederick's place was always meant to be this. We just had to find its purpose." In the main house, Robert was reviewing files with Jessica Alvarez, the program director they had hired in January. A former military dog handler with a master's degree in occupational therapy, Jessica had brought professional credibility and operational expertise that had accelerated the program's development. "The VA is sending Colonel James Mercer," she informed them. "Retired Special Forces, lost his right leg above the knee in Afghanistan. And Marion Foster, former Army nurse with PTSD and anxiety disorders. Both have been on waiting lists for service dogs for over 2 years." Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a purpose. "These aren't just our first placements," he said. "They're our promise to the community that this place can make a real difference." The morning unfolded with meticulous attention to detail. When the VA coordinator arrived with Colonel Mercer and Marion Foster, They were welcomed not with the ostentatious hospitality that had once characterized the estate, but with the focused professionalism of a team dedicated to genuine service. Colonel Mercer, a tall man with the ramrod posture of a career soldier despite his prosthetic leg, assessed the facility with tactical precision. Impressive operation, he acknowledged after the tour. But the real test is the dogs. I need a partner, not a pet. Marion Foster spoke less, but observed everything, her hands occasionally fidgeting with the strap of her bag, a nervous habit that intensified in open spaces or when surprised by sudden movements. The hypervigilance characteristic of her PTSD was evident in the way her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings. The demonstrations proceeded in the main training yard. Scout showcased his mobility assistance skills for Colonel Mercer, while a gentle shepherd mix named Luna demonstrated her ability to create space in crowded situations and provide grounding pressure during anxiety episodes for Ms. Foster. What no one had anticipated was Thor's behavior. Though not officially part of the demonstration, the German shepherd had accompanied the group throughout the tour. When Marion Foster experienced a moment of visible anxiety as a truck backfired in the distance, Thor moved to her side before any human could react, leaning gently against her leg in a textbook grounding technique. He's not even in the program officially, Jessica explained, surprised. He helps with temperament testing, but he knows what's needed, Robert interjected softly. That's what he was trained for originally, to recognize distress and respond appropriately. Marion knelt beside Thor, her breathing steadying as she stroked his fur. This one, she said simply. This is the one I connect with. The unexpected moment crystallized everything the program had been working toward, the genuine connection between human need and canine capacity to fulfill it. There was no artifice, no performance for approval or status, just authentic service. Later that afternoon, after the visitors had departed with preliminary matches established and training schedules arranged, the Morgan family gathered on the cottage porch. The twins had arrived from school, eager to hear about the day's developments. So Thor basically chose his own person, Mark summarized, impressed. That's pretty cool. It means we'll need to adjust some things, Daniel explained. Thor was supposed to be our temperament assessment dog, not a placement. But sometimes the dog knows best. We can train another dog for assessment, Robert said. What matters is that Thor found his purpose, just like this place has. Just like you have, son. Daniel looked out over the property as twilight softened its contours. Where he had once seen only a showcase for wealth, he now saw a living embodiment of service and connection. The money that had nearly destroyed him had been transformed into something of lasting value. You know what I realized today? He said to his family. True respect isn't something you can buy or demand. It's something you earn by adding value to others' lives. Elaine leaned against his shoulder. And that's something you've always been good at, even before the inheritance. You just forgot for a while. As darkness fell, lights came on across Frederick's place. Not the ostentatious display lighting Daniel had installed during his spiral into excess, but practical illumination that served the property's purpose. From the training barns to the main house to the rehabilitation spaces, each light represented work being done, lives being changed, service being rendered. Thor moved from his place beside Daniel to stand at the edge of the porch, alert to something in the distance. Following his gaze, the family watched as a doe and her fawn emerged from the forest edge to graze in the moonlight, unafraid and at peace in their surroundings. Life finds its balance, Robert observed quietly, when we stop fighting against who we're meant to be. Daniel Morgan, once consumed by the need to prove his worth through displays of wealth and power, now found himself centered in a different kind of richness, the wealth of purpose, family, and community. The inheritance that had nearly cost him everything had become the means of discovering what truly mattered. As spring deepened toward summer, Frederick's Place continued its evolution. The first official service dog placements occurred in May, with Colonel Mercer and Scout developing a partnership built on mutual trust and respect. Thor began specialized training with Marion Foster, his innate abilities refined to address her specific needs. Word spread throughout the region about the program's quality and accessibility. Applications increased, volunteer support expanded, and donations began arriving from unexpected sources, evidence of the community's investment in something genuine and valuable. Daniel still owned the hardware store in town, though he had promoted his longtime assistant manager to handle daily operations. He split his time between the business that had sustained his family for decades and the new purpose that had emerged from his greatest challenges. The balance felt right, honoring his past while building a future aligned with his deepest values. One evening in late June, as fireflies began their nightly dance across the meadows of Frederick's Place, Daniel sat with his father on the main house porch. Training had concluded for the day, the dogs were settled in their quarters, and a peaceful quiet had descended over the property. "Your uncle would be proud," Robert said, breaking the comfortable silence. "This is a legacy worth having." Daniel nodded, understanding now what he hadn't when the inheritance first came to him. The money was never the real inheritance, was it? It was the opportunity to choose what kind of man I wanted to be. "And you chose well," Robert replied. After a detour or two, they shared a laugh, the kind that comes from weathering difficulties together and emerging stronger. As twilight deepened into night, Daniel Morgan looked out over the land that had tested, broken, and ultimately redeemed him. What he had once seen as merely a possession to be flaunted had become a canvas for creating genuine value, not through displays of wealth, but through service to others. Thor appeared from the shadows, taking his customary place at Daniel's side. Man and dog sat together, guardians of a place transformed by understanding its true purpose and their own. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched all the way through," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting.